The book is 13 chapters long. It contains roughly 6,000 words. By comparison, that is shorter than this video's script. And yet, for 2,500 years, generals have carried it into battle. Emperors have memorized it before sunrise. Naval commanders have quoted it from the decks of warships. Business executives have annotated it in airport lounges, between flights. Military academies from West Point to Beijing have placed it on mandatory reading lists. Napoleon studied it. Mao Zedong cited it. The CIA assigned it. Mossad trains with it. The Art of War, the most influential book on strategy ever written. And here's the thing that nobody talks about when they hand you a copy. We are not entirely sure the man who wrote it was real. His name, or at least the name history gave him, was Sun Tzu. He was a general in an ancient Chinese kingdom that no longer exists, in a period of Chinese history so violent that historians named it after the season that precedes winter. He may have lived for roughly 50 years, approximately 544 to 496 BCE. He may have commanded armies. He may have written the book. He may have trained the king's concubines as soldiers and executed 2 of them in front of the king himself to prove a point about discipline. Or he may be a legend. Or he may be something rarer and more interesting than either. A man so extraordinary that his own world struggled to fully believe in him, and so profound that every civilization since has refused to let him go. This is the story of Sun Tzu, the warrior, the philosopher, the ghost, the man who looked at the chaos of war and found its geometry. Chapter 1. The World That Made Him. To understand Sun Tzu, you must first understand the world he was born into, because it was not a world of peace, interrupted by war. It was a world of war interrupted, very occasionally, by peace. China in the 6th century BCE was not the unified empire we think of today. There was no emperor. There was no Great Wall. There was a king, technically, the Zhao king. But he was, by the time Sun Tzu was born, little more than a ceremonial figurehead, a stamp on documents that nobody was required to obey. The real China was a patchwork of independent competing states, somewhere between 100 and 140 of them, each with its own armies, its own ambitions, its own hunger for land and power and survival. Historians call this era the Spring and Autumn period, roughly 722 to 481 BCE. The name comes from the historical chronicles of the time, a text called the Spring and Autumn Annals, kept by the scribes of the state of Lu. It is a bureaucratic name for an extraordinarily brutal reality. During the Spring and Autumn period, these states fought each other constantly. Alliances were made and broken in the same season. Cities were besieged, burned, and rebuilt under new flags. Noble families were exterminated, entire lineages erased. The smaller states were absorbed by the larger ones, and by the time Sun Tzu reached adulthood, the 100-plus states of the era had been consolidated down to a handful of major powers locked in permanent grinding competition. The 5 great powers of Sun Tzu's world were Jin in the north, Qi in the northeast, Qin in the west, Chu in the south, enormous, wealthy, and fearsome, and Wu in the southeast, a smaller, younger state near the mouth of the Yangtze River, still considered half barbaric by its more cultured neighbors, still proving itself, still hungry. It is worth pausing on this word barbaric, because the cultivated states of the spring and autumn period used it with genuine contempt. The states of the central Zhou heartland had refined culture, classical music, elaborate ritual, and a code of aristocratic warfare that was almost civilized. Battles in the early spring and autumn period were in theory governed by a code of honor, not entirely unlike European chivalry. You announced your battle in advance. You did not attack an enemy crossing a river. You fed defeated soldiers before sending them home. You did not, under any circumstances, strike a man whose chariot had broken down. This was not warfare as annihilation. It was warfare as elaborate deadly sport, a negotiation between noble houses conducted with bronze weapons. Sun Tzu was going to destroy all of that. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. He was born, probably, in the state of Qi, in the northeastern corner of this fractured world, probably in the year 544 BCE, give or take. His family name was Sun. His personal name was Wu. He would become known as Sun Tzu, the title Tzu meaning master, a honorific used for the great thinkers of the age. He lived in the same era as Confucius. He may have been aware of Confucius's teachings, and Confucius almost certainly would have been deeply uncomfortable with everything Sun Tzu believed. His family background is described as Shi, the landless aristocracy, a class of people who were of noble blood but owned nothing, descendants of lords who had lost their territory in the constant consolidation wars of the period, reduced from rulers to wandering scholars, administrators, soldiers for hire. The Shi were educated, they were trained, they understood protocol and ritual and politics, but they had no land, no titles, no permanent place in the hierarchy. They survived by making themselves useful to whoever held power. Most Shi of Sun Tzu's generation became scholars and advisors. They traveled from court to court, offering wisdom and administrative skill in exchange for food, shelter, and status. Some became diplomats, some became teachers. A few became philosophers of enduring importance. Confucius himself was shy. Sun Tzu became something else. He became a soldier, a mercenary by most accounts, a man who sold military skill on the open market of a world that desperately needed it. He studied war not as an exercise in noble tradition, but as a system, a discipline, a science that could be analyzed, understood, and mastered the way a craftsman masters his trade. At some point during these wandering formative years, he began to write. Chapter 2, the 13 chapters. We do not know exactly when Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War. We know approximately when he lived. We know approximately when the text appeared. The earliest surviving manuscript fragments date to a period consistent with the late spring and autumn, or early Warring States era. The oldest complete text found in archaeological excavation, discovered in 1972 at Yingquishan in bamboo slip form, buried in a Han Dynasty tomb, confirms the text is ancient, though not precisely datable to a single man's hand. What we know is this: someone wrote The Art of War, and whoever that person was, they had seen war. They had smelled it. They had made decisions inside it, under pressure, under exhaustion, in the dark, with imperfect information and impossible stakes. Because the book does not read like theory. It reads like memory. The Art of War is 13 chapters, each addressing a specific dimension of military strategy. But calling it a military manual undersells it catastrophically. It is a philosophy of conflict, a theory of knowledge under uncertainty, a treatise on human psychology disguised as a handbook for generals. The 13 chapters cover strategic planning, waging war and its costs, the offensive, tactical dispositions, the use of energy, weaknesses and strengths, maneuvering, variations and adaptability, the march and terrain, 9 varieties of ground, fire attacks, and perhaps most revolutionary of all, the use of intelligence and spies. That final chapter on intelligence was, in the context of the ancient world, astonishing. The idea that information about your enemy was a military resource as valuable as soldiers, as decisive as terrain, as worthy of investment as bronze weapons and supply chains. This was not how the aristocratic generals of the spring and autumn period thought. They thought about honor. They thought about ritual. They thought about which noble family owed alliance to which. Sun Tzu thought about knowing things the enemy did not know you knew. His central thesis, running like a current beneath all 13 chapters, can be stated simply: war is decided before the first soldier marches. Victory belongs to the general who has already won, in his mind, before the armies meet. The general who has mapped the terrain, counted the enemy's supplies, understood the enemy commander's psychology, identified the enemy's weaknesses, chosen the timing, secured the flanks, and, most crucially, forced the enemy into a position where defeat is inevitable before the battle begins. The worst general in Sun Tzu's philosophy is the one who fights hard battles. The best general is the one who never needs to fight at all. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This idea that the highest form of strategy is to make conflict unnecessary was not new to Asian philosophy. It echoes Taoist principles of Wei Wu Wei, action through inaction, achieving outcomes through alignment rather than force. Sun Tzu was deeply influenced by Taoism, and The Art of War can be read as a Taoist text as much as a military one. The general who flows like water, finding the path of least resistance. The army that adapts its shape like water filling a container. The commander who remains still at the center while everything moves around him. But Sun Tzu was also ruthlessly practical. He was not a pacifist dreaming of a world without war. He lived in a world that was nothing but war. His philosophy was not about avoiding conflict. It was about winning it so decisively, so efficiently, so completely that the cost to both sides was minimized. The fastest victory was the most moral victory because it was the one that ended soonest. In war, then, let your great object be victory, not lengthy campaigns. He understood something that took military theorists in the West centuries to articulate. Prolonged war destroys the victor as surely as the vanquished. An army that wins 10 battles while bankrupting its kingdom has not won anything worth having. These ideas were written, tradition tells us, in the hope that they would be read by someone with the power to use them. And then, if we believe Sima Qian's account, Sun Tzu walked into a palace and handed them to a king. Chapter 3, The King's Test. His name was Helu, and he was the king of Wu. He had come to power in 515 BCE through an assassination. His predecessor, his cousin, had been killed, and Helu had taken the throne. It was not an unusual origin story for the spring and autumn period. Most power in this era came with blood on the hands of the person holding it. Helu was intelligent, ambitious, and hungry. The state of Wu under his rule was on the ascent. It controlled the southeastern coast, the lower Yangtze Valley, fertile rice land, and important trade routes, but it remained, in the eyes of the old Zhou culture states, semi-peripheral, a newcomer, a kingdom that wore the forms of civilization but had not yet earned the full respect of the older powers. Helu wanted more. Specifically, he wanted the state of Chu, enormous, powerful, wealthy Chu, to the northwest. To get there, he needed the best soldiers in the world. According to Sima Qian's account, written in the 2nd century BCE, roughly 300 years after the events it describes, and therefore carrying all the uncertainty that gap implies, a man arrived at court with a manuscript, 13 chapters, a theory of war. Helu read them. Then he summoned the author. The conversation that followed is one of the great scenes in ancient Chinese literature, and it has the quality of a scene designed to be remembered, which may tell us everything, or nothing, about whether it actually happened. The king asked Sun Tzu, "I have read your 13 chapters. Can your theories be applied to all cases without exception?" Sun Tzu said they could. Helu asked, "Can they be applied even to women?" So Helu ordered 180 concubines from his palace harem to be brought into the courtyard. This was the king's test. If Sun Tzu's theories about training and discipline could turn untrained women into soldiers, then perhaps they could turn the men of Wu into an unstoppable army. Sun Tzu divided the women into 2 companies. He appointed 2 of the king's most favored concubines as the commanding officers of their respective units. He issued them spears. He explained, simply, clearly, without condescension, the drill commands: face right, face left, face front, about turn. He asked them, "Do you understand?" The women answered yes. He gave the first command. The women collapsed in laughter, giggling, leaning on their spears, turning the courtyard of the kingdom of Wu into a comedy. Sun Tzu did not shout. He did not rage. He said calmly, "When commands are not clear, when instructions are not properly communicated, it is the fault of the general." He explained the commands again. He asked again, "Do you understand?" The women answered, "Yes." He gave the command again. Again laughter. Sun Tzu said, "When commands are clear and soldiers still do not obey, it is the fault of the officers." He ordered the execution of both concubines. The king, watching from the pavilion above, sent a message immediately. His 2 favorite concubines were to be spared. He would be bereft without them. Their deaths would diminish him. Sun Tzu sent the message back. Once a general has received his commission, he is no longer bound by certain commands of the sovereign. The order stands. The 2 women were beheaded in the courtyard. A new pair of officers was appointed from the ranks. Sun Tzu gave the command. The women drilled in perfect silence, every movement exact, every turn crisp, not a sound except the stamp of feet and the whisper of spears cutting air. He turned to the pavilion and said, "Your soldiers are ready." The king, according to Sima Qian, said nothing for a long moment. Then he descended from the pavilion and appointed Sun Tzu as one of the senior generals of the armies of Wu. Whether this story is literally true, or whether it is a legend constructed to explain a man's philosophy in vivid, unforgettable terms, it does not matter, in a certain sense. The story is the philosophy. The point of it is not cruelty. The point is precision. Orders must be clear. Obedience must be absolute. A general's authority cannot be conditional on the king's comfort. An army in which the commander is subject to the sovereign's emotions in the field is an army that will lose. He will win who, though ruler of men, has his generals under no interference from the sovereign. Sun Tzu wrote that line. The concubine's story is the line made flesh. Chapter 4, The Wars of Wu. In 512 BCE, approximately 2 years after Sun Tzu's appointment as general, King Helu of Wu launched what would become a decade of warfare against the state of Chu. This was not a sudden decision. It was the product of a strategic relationship that had been building for years. Among Helu's most trusted advisors was a man named Wu Zixu, a nobleman from Chu who had fled that state after his family was executed by the Chu king. Wu Zixu had come to Wu burning with the particular intensity of a man who has nothing left to lose except the chance at revenge. He had been advising Helu for years on Chu's weaknesses, its internal politics, its terrain, its supply lines. He was, in the language of the art of war, the perfect spy, a man with intimate knowledge and infinite motivation. Sun Tzu understood the value of this completely. The Wu-Chu Wars of 512 to 506 BCE were not a single campaign, but a sustained strategic pressure. Raids, incursions, probing attacks designed to exhaust Chu's border forces without committing to a single decisive engagement that might go wrong. Sun Tzu's fingerprints are all over this approach. The art of war is relentlessly insistent on not fighting battles you haven't already won. These years of grinding, careful pressure were not hesitation, they were preparation. The state of Chu was enormous. Its army could field hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Wu's forces numbered somewhere between 30 and 35,000. Direct confrontation was madness, but sustained pressure, forcing Chu to respond to multiple simultaneous threats, stretching their forces across a long frontier, depleting their supplies, exhausting their commanders. That was something else entirely. In 506 BCE, Helu made his move. He took an unusual route into Chu, avoiding the direct mountain passes that Chu had fortified and guarded, instead marching deep into the interior through terrain that Chu had not adequately defended because it had not expected anyone to use it. When the Chu army finally positioned itself at Boju, near what is today Hubei province, it was already reacting to events rather than shaping them. This was precisely where Sun Tzu wanted them. The Chu army at Boju numbered somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000, depending on the source. Wu's army was 33,000 at most. They engaged 5 times in a single day. 5 battles, 5 Wu victories. The exact mechanics of how 33,000 soldiers defeated an army 10 times their size in a single day will be argued by military historians for as long as there are military historians. The available ancient sources are incomplete and contradictory in detail. What is not disputed is the outcome. Chu was shattered. Wu captured the Chu capital, the city of Ying. The Chu king fled into exile. Chu, the dominant regional power of the spring and autumn period, never fully recovered. And Wu, the semi-barbaric southeastern kingdom that nobody had quite taken seriously, became the most powerful state in China. Sima Qian wrote it was in part due to Sun Tzu. That hedge, in part, is Sima Qian being careful. He knew the record was incomplete. He knew other commanders had played decisive roles. Fu Gai, the king's brother, had led a key charge at Boju without orders and turned the battle. Wu Zixu's intimate knowledge of Chu was irreplaceable. Helu himself was a skilled and brave commander. But Sun Tzu's influence on how the campaign was conceived, the patient pressure, the unorthodox route, the psychological preparation, the intelligence gathering, was the architecture beneath everything else. The general who wins the battle is visible. The strategist who made the victory possible often goes unnamed. Chapter 5, The Philosophy of the Invisible Army. Let us stop here, in the middle of the military history, and go deeper into the ideas. Because Sun Tzu's actual philosophy is stranger and more radical than the quotes on motivational posters suggest. When people encounter the art of war today, they usually encounter it in one of 2 forms: the full text, which rewards careful reading but requires patience, or the cherry-picked quotation, the lines that sound wise and universal, extracted from their military context and applied to business meetings and romantic relationships and competitive sports. These quotations are not wrong. They are, genuinely, universally applicable, but extracted from the text, they lose the system that gives them their power. So let us look at the actual structure of Sun Tzu's thought. The first principle is, all warfare is based on deception. This is the most famous line in the text and the most misunderstood. Sun Tzu is not saying that wars are won by lying. He is saying that the fundamental nature of strategic conflict is the management of information. What your enemy knows and does not know about you, what you know and do not know about them, and how you exploit the gap between these. The general who is transparent is defeated. The general who controls the narrative of his own strength, his own position, his own intentions, holds the decisive advantage. When you are strong, appear weak. When you are weak, appear strong. When you are near, make it seem you are far. When you are far, make it seem you are near. These are not tricks. They are the fundamental mechanics of competitive advantage in a world where decisions are made on imperfect information. Every military commander, since Sun Tzu, every business strategist, every negotiator, every chess player, operates within this framework, whether they know it or not. The second great principle is what we might call the economics of war. The Art of War's second chapter is on the costs of extended campaigns, and it reads almost like a finance treatise. Sun Tzu itemizes with forensic precision the daily cost of maintaining an army in the field, the food, the weapons, the equipment that degrades, the supply chains that are vulnerable, the economic ripple effects on the kingdom as a whole. He is making a specific argument. Wars of attrition destroy everyone. The goal of every campaign must be the fastest possible decisive victory, achieved with the minimum possible expenditure. This principle was radical in an era when wars often dragged on for years, because the aristocratic generals of the period were not thinking about the kingdom's economics. They were thinking about honor and precedent and reputation. Sun Tzu did not care about any of those things. He cared about outcomes, and he understood that an army that spent 2 years winning a war had perhaps destroyed more of its own foundation than the enemy's sword could have managed. The third principle, the one that reaches deepest into psychology, is the doctrine of formlessness. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing. An army should have no fixed form. It should be adaptable, responsive, shapeless enough that the enemy cannot find a reliable edge to grip. The moment your strategy becomes predictable, you have handed the enemy a weapon. The moment your tactics become routine, you are training the enemy in how to defeat you. This principle does not appear only in military history. It appears in every competitive domain where the best practitioners have discovered it independently. The jazz musician who refuses to play the same solo twice, the martial artist who responds to the opponent rather than executing a predetermined sequence, the startup that avoids announcing its roadmap to competitors. They are all drinking from the same philosophical well that Sun Tzu drew from 2,500 years ago. And then there is the principle most people never notice, buried in the text like a sleeper waiting to be activated. Sun Tzu was more concerned with preserving the enemy than destroying them. To fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. The ideal outcome is not slaughter. The ideal outcome is that the enemy surrenders, or better, comes to understand that resistance is futile without the need for a battle at all. Because a battle costs you soldiers, it costs you supplies, it costs you time and momentum, and a defeated enemy whose army is intact is an asset. They can be absorbed, reorganized, redirected. An enemy city taken without siege is an asset. Its walls are intact, its granaries full, its people alive and productive. This is profoundly different from how most of the ancient world thought about war. In this era, victory was measured by the number of enemy heads taken, the wealth plundered, the cities burned. Sun Tzu was interested in something more durable. He was interested in winning permanently. The shadow. Was Sun Tzu real? Around the 12th century CE, Chinese scholars began raising an uncomfortable question. It had been quietly accumulating for years, in the margins of commentaries and the asides of historical analyses. But it was in the Song Dynasty period that it was first stated plainly and publicly in the form of a genuine scholarly challenge. Did Sun Tzu actually exist? It is a legitimate question, and it deserves a serious, careful answer. not dismissal in either direction. The case for Sun Tzu's historical existence rests primarily on Sima Qian, the great Han Dynasty historian who compiled the records of the Grand Historian in the 2nd century BCE. Sima Qian was, by the standards of any era, a serious and conscientious historian. He traveled extensively, consulted multiple sources, and was willing to express uncertainty when his evidence was incomplete. His biography of Sun Tzu is brief, a few hundred characters, but it is specific. It names the king, names the test with the concubines, names the Battle of Boju, claims Sun Tzu as a major commander. If Sima Qian says Sun Tzu existed, that is not nothing. But the case for skepticism is substantial. The Zuo Zhuan, a meticulously detailed chronicle of spring and autumn period events, compiled during the 4th century BCE from sources closer to the period than Sima Qian was, discusses the Battle of Boju at length. It names the Wu commanders, it provides tactical details, it records the political consequences, and it does not mention Sun Tzu. More troublingly, no spring and autumn period source, no inscription, no court record, no contemporary chronicle mentions a person named Sun Wu serving King Hela. The name simply does not appear in the historical record of the period it supposedly describes. The scholars who doubt Sun Tzu's historical existence suggest an alternative, that the art of war was composed, perhaps by multiple authors, perhaps over multiple generations, sometime in the Warring States period, the era following the spring and autumn period, perhaps in the 4th or 3rd century BCE. This was a period of even more intense interstate warfare, a period in which professional generals had become fully established as a social category, and in which military strategy was a subject of serious scholarly debate. Attributing the text to a legendary general from an earlier era, giving it the authority of a named historical figure, was not unusual in ancient Chinese textual culture. Other classical texts were attributed to legendary or semi-legendary figures to give them weight. The discovery in 1972 of the Yinkeshan bamboo slips, a Han Dynasty tomb burial containing both the Art of War and fragments of a second text, Sun Bin's Art of War, attributed to Sun Bin, a supposed descendant of Sun Tzu, provides some support for a real lineage. But even this does not definitively prove a historical Sun Wu in the 6th century BCE. Here is where the honest answer must be stated. We do not know. We are working with sources that are, at minimum, 3 centuries removed from the events they describe, in a period of Chinese history for which the documentary record is genuinely fragmentary. The absence of evidence is not conclusive. The spring and autumn period left us a relatively thin documentary record overall, and the presence of evidence from Sima Qian is not conclusive either. Sima Qian was working from sources that may have been legendary by his time. But here is the thing that the academic debate sometimes obscures. Whether Sun Wu the individual existed or not, whether one man wrote all 13 chapters in the 6th century BCE, or whether the text was assembled over generations and attributed to a legendary master, the intellectual achievement represented by the art of war is real. The synthesis is real. The system is real. Whoever produced those ideas, one person or many, in one generation or across several, had access to actual military experience and genuine philosophical depth. And the influence is real, undeniably, inarguably real. The states of the Warring States period studied the text. The Qin armies that unified China studied it. The Han Dynasty generals who secured the empire studied it. Every subsequent dynasty produced new commentaries on it. Japanese samurai absorbed it into their martial culture. Mao Zedong applied it. Modern military establishments teach it. If Sun Tzu is a legend, he is the most operationally useful legend in the history of human conflict. If he was real, he was one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived. Either way, he is real enough. He was real enough to last 2,500 years. He was real enough that you are still here, watching this. Chapter 7. The Fall of Wu, and the cruelest irony. In Fornai Helu of Wu died. Not gloriously. An arrow, or a sword cut, accounts differ, on a botched campaign against the southern state of Yue. The wound turned. He died on the march home. His son Fuchai took the throne. And here is where the tragedy begins. Fuchai had talent. He had courage. He was a competent field commander. But he had grown up inside success, surrounded by the evidence of Wu's greatness. raised by a victorious king, insulated from failure in every direction, and success teaches the wrong lessons. Where Hellu was patient, Fuchai was rash. Where Hellu was calculating, Fuchai was proud. Where Hellu sought uncomfortable truth, Fuchai sought comfortable agreement. Wu Zixu, the intelligence backbone of the Chu campaign, one of the most valuable strategic minds Hellu ever had, kept serving under the new king. And Fuchai, who didn't like Wu Zixu's persistence or his personality or his habit of raising the same warnings again and again, eventually had him executed. The warning Wu Zixu kept raising was Yue. King Gujian of Yue, the man whose forces had killed Hellu, had been captured, humiliated, forced to work as Fuchai's groom. He had endured it, he had waited, and while he waited, he had been rebuilding. Sun Tzu had written, "Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant." He had written, "Appear at points the enemy must hasten to defend." He had written, "The victorious soldier wins first, then goes to war." Gujian had read or absorbed or independently arrived at every single one of those principles. For years he kept his ambitions invisible. He sent tribute, he praised Wu's glory, he performed submission so convincingly that Fuchai, who wanted to believe it, believed it completely. And beneath the performance, Gujian rebuilt his army, his treasury, his alliances, patiently, in a way that his opponent, increasingly drunk on triumph, was incapable of matching. Fuchai, meanwhile, marched north, into the Zhou heartland, chasing the prestige of being recognized as the dominant lord of his era. He was thinking about reputation, about legacy, about acknowledgement. He was thinking about everything except the South. This was the most complete violation of Sun Tzu's principles possible. Know your enemy and know yourself. Fuchai did not know Gujian, or rather, he refused to. He had decided that Gujian was a defeated subordinate. That decision was comfortable. Comfort is the enemy of strategic clarity. Wu Zixu told him repeatedly, "Gujian is the real threat. The South is unguarded. U.S. submission is a performance. This is going to end badly." Fuchai had Wu Zixu executed for his persistence. He sent the body to be thrown in the Yangtze River. By the traditional account, Wu Zixu asked before his death that his eyes be removed from his skull and mounted above the southern gate of the Wu capital, so that he could watch with dead eyes what was coming from Yue. In 473 BC, nearly 2 decades after Hellu's death, Yue invaded Wu. Fuchai was far from home, his army exhausted, his treasury strained, his best advisor murdered on his orders, no intelligence network, no warning. Nothing. Wu was conquered. Fuchai, surrounded and out of options, killed himself. Wu, the state elevated to greatness by Sun Tzu's ideas, that had shattered the most powerful military in China with a force 1/10 its size, that had been the dominant power in the region, was erased. The state destroyed by ignoring the art of war was not Chu, not Qi. It was Wu itself, destroyed by a king who had the book in his palace and refused to read it, who had inherited the greatest strategic tradition of his era and wasted it on pride. Sun Tzu had written, "He will win who has military capacity and is not interfered with by the sovereign." Fuchai was the sovereign, and Fuchai interfered, fatally, with every capacity that might have saved him. As for Sun Tzu himself, his name vanishes from the record around the time of Hellu's death, gone before the disaster. Whether by death, retirement, or choice, we don't know. Some traditions say he withdrew to write, to teach, to refine the text. Some say he saw in Fuchai exactly what he could not work with, and left. Perhaps the wisest general in Chinese history recognized a king who would not listen, and understood with perfect clarity that there was nothing more to be done. Chapter 8, the book travels the world. The art of war outlived the kingdom that produced it. It survived the warring states period, 2 centuries of even more intense conflict, 475 to 221 BCE, as the surviving major states fought each other to exhaustion. It survived the unification of China under Qin Shi Huang, survived the burning of the books because military strategy was among the categories spared, survived the fall of the Qin and the rise of the Han dynasty, which explicitly valued it and produced the earliest important commentaries. In the 6th century CE, it crossed the water to Japan. A Buddhist monk, by one account, though the details vary. What is beyond dispute, Japan was ready. The warrior culture developing around Bushido found in Sun Tzu not a foreign import, but a crystallization of something it had always sensed. The daimyo studied it, the samurai applied it. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who unified Japan in 1603, is said to have carried a personal copy. Takeda Shingen used a line from it as his battle standard: wind, forest, fire, mountain. It reached Europe through a Jesuit missionary. Jean-Joseph Marie Amiot, working in China during the 18th century, produced the first Western translation into French, published in Paris in 1772. Napoleon Bonaparte was alive and not yet 30 in 1772. Whether he read it is debated. But Napoleonic strategy, speed, concentration of force, striking weakness, forcing the enemy to respond, is, to say the least, consistent with what Sun Tzu prescribed. Karl von Clausewitz arrived at many of the same conclusions by a different route. Both men understood that war is an extension of politics. Both understood the primacy of the decisive engagement. Both understood that fog, imperfect information, unpredictable variables, human psychology is permanent and irreducible. Where they differ most is style. Clausewitz is dense, dialectical, systematic. Sun Tzu is aphoristic, oblique, Taoist. They are mapping the same territory from opposite ends of the world. The maps are, in their most important features, compatible. In the 20th century, the art of war entered the bloodstream of modern military culture definitively. Mao Zedong stated explicitly that it had informed his guerrilla strategy: a smaller mobile force, avoid decisive engagement with the larger enemy, strike weak points, retreat before the enemy concentrates, build strength patiently over years while appearing weak. That is Mao's 3 phases of guerrilla warfare. It is also, in essence, the Wuchu campaign of 512 to 506 BCE. American strategists, encountering an enemy in Vietnam who applied exactly these principles against overwhelming conventional superiority, began studying the book with new urgency. Fighting a patient, formless, intelligent insurgency that refused to engage on American terms forced a reckoning with ideas American military culture had underweighted for decades. And then, in the 1980s, James Clavell published a short commercial edition with a preface arguing it should be assigned reading for every business person in America. It sold in quantities that stunned the publishing industry. It appeared on every executive's desk. It was quoted in investor presentations, management consultancy reports, strategy retreats in the mountains. Was this a misappropriation? In some sense, yes. Sun Tzu was writing about situations where the stakes were the survival of kingdoms and the lives of thousands of soldiers. A hostile corporate takeover is not the Battle of Boju. A quarterly earnings shortfall is not the fall of Wu. But the structural principles hold wherever competition happens. The management of information, knowing your competitor as well as you know yourself, the virtue of speed and concentration, the danger of extended campaigns that exhaust resources, the necessity of formlessness and adaptability. They apply because they describe the geometry of competitive decision-making under uncertainty, and that geometry does not change with the domain. Chapter 9. The Philosophy of Knowing. Let us go one final time to the deepest level of the text. The Art of War is ultimately not a book about war. It is a book about knowing. Everything in the text, the strategic calculations, the troop dispositions, the terrain analysis, the intelligence gathering, the deception operations, all of it is in service of a single underlying imperative. Know reality as it is, not as you wish it were. This sounds simple. It is extraordinarily difficult. Most human failures, in war and in every other domain, are failures of knowing. Generals who overestimate their own strength, commanders who underestimate the enemy, leaders who surround themselves with advisors who tell them what they want to hear, institutions so long successful that they've stopped questioning their own assumptions, individuals so invested in a particular self-image that they cannot afford to see their own weaknesses clearly. Sun Tzu had seen every variation of these failures. Armies marching confidently to destruction because their generals hadn't done the arithmetic. Kingdoms declining because their kings had confused prestige with power, reputation with capability, the performance of strength with its reality. His response was to demand a standard of knowing that most people in most circumstances find deeply uncomfortable. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. The first condition, knowing both, is the condition of the master. Rare. It requires a kind of intellectual discipline that cuts through the ego's protective distortions, that looks at your own weaknesses and your own limitations with the same forensic clarity you apply to studying your opponents. The second condition, knowing yourself but not the enemy, describes the brave amateur, capable, incomplete. They will win some and lose some, roughly evenly. The third condition, knowing neither, is the condition of the gambler. They enter every competition on hope and momentum eventually run out. Hilu was the first condition. Fuchai was the third. The results were exactly what Sun Tzu, with mathematical precision, said they would be. The knowledge Sun Tzu demands is not just military intelligence, though intelligence is part of it. It is a comprehensive, ego-free, reality-oriented awareness of the entire strategic situation. Your resources, your weaknesses, your opponent's strengths, the terrain, the timing, the political context, the psychological state of your own forces. It is the kind of knowledge that requires the general to be, above all other things, honest with himself. This is why the book endures. Not because warfare hasn't changed. It has changed almost beyond recognition. The chariots are gone. The bronze weapons are gone. The states of the spring and autumn period are gone, along with their kings and their politics and their courtly rituals. Many of the specific tactical recommendations are obsolete in their particulars. But the challenge of knowing clearly, of seeing the world as it is rather than as you need it to be, is not obsolete. It will not be obsolete next century or next millennium. We are all, always, operating with incomplete information and egos that distort our perception. The strategist who corrects for this, who builds habits of honest knowing into the practice of decision-making, will always outperform the one who does not. Sun Tzu wrote the manual for the correction. That is why you can walk into any management school, any military academy, any intelligence training facility, any championship sports program in the world, and find a copy of a book written in ancient China about armies that no longer exist, in a kingdom erased before the birth of Alexander the Great. The weapons are obsolete. The wisdom is not. Chapter 10, The Last Things We Know. There is a hill in Huchu, near Suzhou, in what is now Jiangsu province, where a modest tomb stands among old trees and inclined stones. Tradition identifies it as the resting place of Sun Tzu. Whether his remains are actually there is, like so much else about this man, unknown. The tomb was identified in later centuries, in the way that significant historical figures often acquire specific burial sites long after any reliable record of where they were actually laid to rest has vanished. It attracts visitors, scholars, soldiers on study tours, tourists who have read the book and felt something they cannot quite name while reading it, ordinary people who understand that they are standing near, or at least near the idea of, one of the most influential human beings who ever lived, or near the legend, or near the text. The man, the legend, and the text have become, after 2,500 years, inseparable, and perhaps that inseparability is the truest measure of what Sun Tzu was, or what Sun Tzu became, which may amount to the same thing. He has been claimed by everyone. Chinese nationalists have claimed him as a national genius. Japanese martial culture absorbed him so completely that the attribution sometimes disappeared. Western militaries studied him as a guide to asymmetric warfare. Business culture appropriated him as a prophet of competitive strategy. Modern sports coaches quote him in locker rooms before championship games. He has been misquoted, misattributed, oversimplified, turned into poster art and corporate slogans and self-help bromides. None of this diminishes the text, because the text is still there, unchanged, asking the same questions it has always asked. Before you act, have you calculated? Before you engage, have you prepared the conditions? Do you know the terrain? Do you know the enemy? Do you know yourself? Truly, without the flattery that most people extend to their own self-image as a matter of psychological survival. These are not comfortable questions. Sun Tzu never promised comfort. He promised clarity. And clarity in his philosophy is both the most demanding and the most valuable thing a leader can possess. He who exercises no forethought but makes light of his opponents is sure to be captured by them. There is a kind of person who encounters the art of war and experiences it as permission. Permission for ruthlessness, for manipulation, for treating other people as obstacles to be managed and outmaneuvered. They quote the deception principles with relish and miss the discipline principles entirely. They remember appear weak when you are strong, and forget, know yourself. This is a misreading and an ironic one. The kind of leader Sun Tzu describes as dangerous to their own side is precisely the leader who reads Sun Tzu as a license for cleverness without discipline. The general who is brilliant at deception but undisciplined in preparation, who manipulates information but has not done the fundamental work of knowing his own capabilities and limitations honestly, is not a Sun Tzu general. He is Fuchai. He is the cautionary tale. The Sun Tzu general is the one who has done the unglamorous work. The counting, the calculating, the honest self-assessment, the patient intelligence gathering, the preparation that happens before anyone is watching, so thoroughly that by the time the battle comes, victory is not uncertain. It is the formal conclusion of work already done. This is, in the end, Sun Tzu's deepest gift to anyone who encounters the text seriously, a model of what mastery actually looks like. It does not look like inspiration. It does not look like courage on the day. It does not look like genius improvisation in the moment of crisis. It looks like preparation. It looks like knowledge. It looks like honesty. And it looks like patience. The patience to wait for the conditions that make victory inevitable, rather than merely possible. The good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat, and then waited for an opportunity to defeat the enemy. First, put yourself beyond the possibility of defeat. That is the work. That is the discipline. That is what the art of war is actually about, underneath every tactical recommendation and strategic principle. It is about a standard of preparation so complete, so honest, so comprehensive, that failure becomes genuinely difficult. Sun Tzu left us the standard. Whether he was a single man who walked into a palace in the state of Wu in 512 BCE, with 13 chapters in his hands, or whether he was the distilled intelligence of a generation of strategists who worked across decades, he left us the standard. And 2,500 years is enough time to know whether a standard is worth keeping. The sun rises over Huqiu in the same way it has risen over it for 3,000 years. Light moves across old stone. Trees that have stood longer than any dynasty still standing cast the same shadows they cast when there was no city of Suzhou nearby, no province of Jiangsu, no nation called China in the form we know it. Birds in the morning, incense smoke from nearby offerings rising into still air. Somewhere in this landscape, the man who may or may not have been Sun Tzu lived his last years. He had served a king. He had helped build an empire from a minor state. He had written the words that are still being read today, still being taught today, still being argued about today. He had done enough. He had done more than enough. There is a type of legacy that requires constant maintenance, monuments that need repair, institutions that need champions, ideas that survive because people with power have decided to preserve them. And there is a rarer type, the kind that survives on its own because it is simply true enough, useful enough, profound enough to outlast every structure that might have preserved or destroyed it. The art of war is the second type. It survived the fall of Wu. It survived the Qin book burning. It survived the fall of the Han dynasty and the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period and the Tang and Song and Ming and Qing. It survived the 20th century, which tried to destroy everything old. It is surviving the 21st century, which is trying to make everything disposable. It will survive us, not because any institution is protecting it, though institutions do, not because any government has mandated it, though governments have, but because every serious person who encounters it in any competitive domain at any point in history finds that it is describing something they already knew was true but had not been able to articulate. The feeling of recognition, that is the art of war's deepest power. Not novelty, not the thrill of encountering something completely unprecedented, but recognition. The feeling of a principle that was already in you, in some form, in some nascent intuition about how competition and knowledge and preparation and timing relate to each other, suddenly given a precise and permanent form. So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak. Yes, you knew that. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing. Therefore, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare there are no constant conditions. Yes, you knew that too. Hence, that general is skillful in attack whose opponent does not know what to defend, and he is skillful in defense whose opponent does not know what to attack. You knew this. You had felt it, in some form, in every competitive situation you had ever navigated. You just did not have the words. Sun Tzu gave you the words. That is what the greatest teachers do. They do not invent the truth. They find the truth that is already latent in human experience, and they give it a form precise and memorable enough that it can be carried forward, given to the next generation, and the next, until it has traveled so far from its origin that nobody remembers exactly where it began. It began, probably, with a man named Sun Wu in a kingdom called Wu in the 6th century before the Common Era, in a world that was burning. He watched the burning carefully. He wrote down what he saw, and the words have not gone out. The Art of War. 13 chapters, 6,000 words. The most influential book on strategy in human history.